Hello and welcome to Oddball Reviews. I am the Oddball Reviewer. Today we're going to be going over The Hobbit. I call myself the Oddball Reviewer just because my strange taste in books. However, today The Hobbit is relatively normal book to be reviewing, but we'll go for it anyway. Um, I guess the first thing to say about The Hobbit is that it is pretty much a children's book. A It's a good children's book, but it's definitely not perfect. You can pretty much tell that JRR Tolkien was a young author uh, making a good first attempt, but he wasn't perfect yet. I mean, in my opinion, The Hobbit would have been forgotten by time if it were not for The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings was, of course, many decades in the making, whereas I think The Hobbit was just meant to be a kid's story. With all that said, it is done well. It just has issues. Brief summary for those in the world who haven't actually read The Hobbit or watched The Hobbit. Essentially, Bilbo is visited by Gandalf and a bunch of dwarves, and they ask him to go on an adventure, and of course he does. And he ends up fighting trolls, and he fights goblins and spiders, and of course smog. And eventually they make it to the mountain and they get the treasure back. They kill the dragon, all that jazz. Um, the biggest issue I have with the story as a whole is that it is a very disparate bunch of stories. It's not one story. It's I mean, it starts with Bilbo meeting the hobbits. That's its own story, and then eventually Bilbo meeting the Bilbo meeting the dwarves, and then that's its own story. And then they move on from that, and they meet the trolls, and they what happens at the trolls. That's its own story, and then they go to Elrond's. Then the goblins is its own story, and so on and so forth. All the way through the book, it's all these individual stories that are put into a major book. And there's no real, I don't know, continuity through it. It does have continuity, but it does feel like they are separate stories. One of the best examples I can think of is that the Arkenstone. In the movies, of course, they find the ark or the Arkenstone is brought up early on. It's alluded to what its power is, what it is about from the very beginning. But in the books, it's like, oh, Bilbo found the Arkenstone by happenstance, and then they tell the story of the Arkenstone. It's like J.R.R. Tolkien thought, hey, this is a good element to put in there. Let's put that in there. And then he came up with a backstory about it. And I never went back in the story and like alluded to it before or put in any clues about what it was about. Um, and it just feels like in the book that it's just this element that's shoved into the story, not that it's a integral part of the story, even though it kind of is. Um, let's see. Like I say, everything's its own self-contained story. It feels like there's a beginning, middle, and end to each one of these parts, including mundane things like uh, approaching Bjorn. Like there's this whole thing about introducing each dwarf two at a time, and it's this long drawn out thing, and it doesn't really feel necessary, but I don't know, it just becomes part of the story, and it's kind of this desperate or disparate mess of different stories all kludged together to become one story. One element that's very weird is that you would believe from the beginning that they're going to defeat smog, that's the whole point of the book. Sure, at the beginning it's all about burglary. They're not actually going to kill smog. They're just going to go steal from him. But I mean, they get there and they don't kill Smog. The people of Lake Town kill Smog after Smog, kills half of the town and all of this stuff. But they don't actually do that. So the climax of the book, or that's not the climax of the book. The climax is actually the Battle of Five Armies, which it feels like it comes out of nowhere in the book. Maybe not nowhere, but it definitely doesn't feel like it was set up at all before this. Suddenly, it's all about, yeah, the battle, I guess, about Thorin being a dick, and I mean he is a major dick. Like he does nothing to deserve the treasure that he's gotten. Um, all he did was piss off the dragon, and the dragon went to kill the people of Lake Town, and the people of Lake Town uh, killed the dragon. So how what did Thorin do to deserve the treasure? And he absolutely refuses to give them anything for it, especially after they already, they helped him. They they had a whole big party for him and they gave him all the supplies that they needed and all this stuff, and then he turns around and is a terrible, terrible character. And all right, the next part is about characters, and I'd say Bilbo and Gandalf are pretty great characters. I mean, obviously they're the main characters, but I would say that the dwarves were absolute crap. I mean, if you look at them, there's hardly any difference between them at all. Like seriously, three characters maybe have uh, character, and the rest of them you wouldn't be able to tell one dwarf from the other. And the three that have character, one of them is Thorin, another one is the old one, and another one is the fat one. Then you kind of got the young ones; they kind of got a little bit more character, but the rest of them, like, you cannot tell them different. And that's one thing that the movies actually did better than the books, which was to give the dwarves character. Um, Otherwise, there's nothing about them. And the worst part about them is that they are some of the most useless characters in any book I have ever read. And I mean that. Like, against the trolls, they just get captured and saved by Gandalf. Against the goblins, they get captured and saved by Gandalf. Against the wargs, they get chased up trees and get saved by the eagles. Then they move on and they get into Mirkwood and they are captured by the spiders and are, since Gandalf's gone now, they get saved by Bilbo. And once they get out of that, then they get captured by the elves. And who's there to save them but Bilbo? And then they move on and they get to Lake Town, and Lake Town helps them out. Then they move on to the mountain, and the dwarves don't actually do anything at the mountain. They just they need to find the gate, and guess who finds it? Bilbo. And then when they get to the gate, guess who figures out how to open it? Bilbo. And then once they're inside, they send Bilbo down alone to the hoard of gold, and they do nothing. They literally do nothing throughout the entire story. The biggest thing that they do throughout the story is essentially block off the mountain so nobody else can get in after the dragon is killed. Like, what did they do? It the first time I read it, which I read it as, like, I don't know, 12-year-old, um, it didn't bother me. But reading it as an adult, I'm just like, holy crap, are these dwarves ever going to do anything? And that's the thing. It's a kid's book. It's meant for kids. It's watching Bilbo and Gandalf save the dwarves from all of these things. It's not necessarily about. It's not supposed to have a better, more highbrow plot. It obviously wasn't thought out as well as The Lord of the Rings, but that's kind of an unfair comparison, so we won't. I'm going to have a video on that soon. But as far as The Hobbit's concerned, it's just uh, unfocused, is the best way I can put it. There's just nothing, no plot threads that kind of go all the way through. It's just a bunch of little plot threads being pulled at throughout the book, and eventually it ends in the Battle of Five Armies. And of course, Thorin's been such a dickhead this whole time. The only way to redeem his character is to have him die. So yeah, that happens. Um, anyway, as far as I guess I did kind of go over the story a little bit, or not the story. Sorry. The next part was the writing style, which honestly, you can tell JRR Tolkien was doing this when he was younger. It's not nearly as polished as some of his later writings. Well, The Lord of the Rings, obviously, but I haven't really read much else beyond that, so I can't really comment. But anyway, The Lord of the Rings felt like a polished, finished book. It felt like it was real. This felt like it was somebody playing it, writing. And there's plenty of reasons for that. Uh, there wasn't really necessarily grammatical errors. It was more like storytelling faux pas that you wouldn't do nowadays. A good example is just how much head hopping there is, uh, how many times you just bumble into a situation with no preamble, no lead up at all. It just happens. Obviously, I went over the fact that it's a bunch of different stories and stuff. But anyway, it it does not feel polished, I guess I would say. And I believe if J.R.R. Tolkien would have had the chance to do it better, he probably would have. But it definitely didn't feel like it was part of the Lord of the Rings. It felt like it was its own thing, and as I say, it probably would have been forgotten by history. Now, as far as like my rating of it, uh, I think I would give it something like a 6 out of 10. It's enjoyable, but it's definitely not perfect by any means. And as a kid, I loved it, but as an adult, not so much. Um, yeah, I think that's probably good enough. I have this thing where I'm gonna start doing the strange-o-meter or the odometer or whatever you want to call it, because yeah. But this one doesn't really rank very highly on the odometer. It kind of does, but not really. I'd maybe give it a 4 out of 10. In oddness, mostly just because of the weird shenanigans that the dwarves get into. But it's definitely not the kind of book that would be on my radar if it was not such a classic. And that's about all I can say about it. Anyway, I say that's about it for this rant. My name is L.W. Greenwood. I am the author of the Fire of Life series, and I would really appreciate it if you checked out my book. Otherwise, stay odd, people.